became upset with Zwingli, who was, you got to remember, Zwingli kind of started off religious power as far as kind of raising people through his reforms. It then allowed him to become somebody important on the town council, part of government, and then during some of the reforms, when these people had questions about what the church was doing, instead of Zwingli giving them answers, he would just refer them to the town council. So they saw him kind of just pushing them off on more government. They didn't like what was going on with that, so they kind of became tired of what he was saying as well. So what they did, these two individuals, Mans and Grebel, they began to meet with other people to discover what a church patterned more like the New Testament might look like. Okay, so you've got the same Anabaptist Reformation pushed away from Luther going on in Germany, and you got another one going on in Europe as well. So you got two of them kind of going on at the same time. Okay, so two different regions of the world, obviously. Two different regions of Europe, but kind of the same type of Reformation taking place. One of the big things they pushed back against, of course, was infant baptism. And I know we talked about this a little bit last week. Why is the rejection of infant baptism such a big deal? What do the Catholics believe about infant baptism? It removes original sin, right? So if you're, as a doctrinal stance, pushing against that, that is a direct right jab to the Catholic Church. Okay, it's a direct opposition to them. So that gets rid of the idea that infant baptism clears of original sin. And that essentially, because of that, then now we've got Mance and Grebel both being baptized to show that they weren't accepting the fact of this infant baptism anymore. And that this event, these two men, along with another guy named George Blorick, who was another leader that kind of took this Anabaptist movement further, that was what we call the event that was the start of the major Anabaptist Reformation. Okay, because you got a priest, you got Zwingli's main right-hand guys who are kind of branching out on their own. So that was kind of the start of what we would call the Anabaptist movement, as far as in Zurich was going on. Now, the Anabaptists were trying to imitate the New Testament church. Okay, therefore they weren't seeking help from any secular authorities. They had Roman Catholic pushback as well as Protestant pushback. Now, we mentioned this last week, right? This now moves from, instead of it being the Catholic Church and the people not the Catholic Church kind of at odds, this becomes a threefold fight, essentially, for good sound doctrine. You've got the Catholic Church, you have the Protestant Reformation being led by Zwingli and Martin Luther, and now you're going to have a division of that in the Anabaptist Reformation, kind of a three-part division now that kind of heads out. Okay, so because of Martin Luther's status and because of Zwingli's status in the political era, the political arena, the Protestant Reformation kind of became its own thing, and you had a lot of people kind of listening to those guys and following those guys. Then you have this other new division of Anabaptists that kind of branched out as well. So both the Protestant community and the Roman Catholic Church reached out to try to stop this Anabaptist movement, because they feared that the pacifist way of teaching that they were going through is going to endanger Europe. And then during this time, if we can just jump over here to what we call more of a secular history, there's wars going on right now in Europe. The Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman armies are just launching attacks at the European feudalism system, trying to conquer as much land and as much people as possible. So you got the Catholic Church obviously very much involved in the military, Protestant Church Reformation kind of getting to gain some political power, and you've got a division of Anabaptists who are pacifists, who didn't think fighting or anything was going on. So to take more and more people away from fighting, it's going to be easier to conquer. All right, so they're worried about that going on. So they tried to get this thing stopped. but it didn't work. All right, they couldn't quite get it stopped. Now, for the Catholics specifically, the rejection of infant baptism was the greatest of all threats, because that means a complete change from all Catholic theology. Okay, that was the biggest threat for them. Because infant baptism, that was the obligation for each new Catholic to kind of go through everything needed to go through to get to where all the penance and all the stuff they had to do. Okay? Now, so those are two, attacks that went on the Radical Reformation. They also, then, as we can see there in Part C of this, they were beleaguered by fanatics. Now, 1529, we can now describe people as Lutheran preachers. All right? So a Lutheran lay preacher, a guy by the name of Hoffman, he parted from being a follower of Luther and then became obsessed with the day of the Lord. Okay? What does that mean? We'll get to it in a second. Okay? He preached in Holland, Inman, Germany, and he won a whole bunch of followers as well. As a matter of fact, in 1530, just on one Sunday, he baptized 300 individuals. But he became disillusioned, when 10 of those people were executed in 1531. So he travels to Strasbourg, which is in Germany, where he eventually becomes imprisoned till his death. Okay, so Hoffman was another Radical Reformation outlier away from Lutheran teaching, and he eventually is put to death. Was imprisoned until he died because of that. Now, in the absence of Hoffman, now if you think, if in one day Hoffman was able to essentially baptize 300 people, he was obviously gaining some steam, and a lot of people were listening to him. So in his absence, when he was gone, a self-appointed successor who won over more Anabaptists, and he claimed that Munster, Germany, was in fact New Jerusalem. Okay, since he's going to get a little more crazy here as we kind of look at some of these things. And he eventually wanted all of the non-Anabaptists, to leave the city because Munster, Germany was going to be New Jerusalem. 1534, we got more Catholic Church and Lutheran forces, a coalition of them together. They take the city over. They come in, they execute the leaders. David Jorish, Obie Phillips, Minnow Simmons, they led the beleaguered Anabaptists of the region back to a more biblical understanding of the church and a much more sound doctrine in their eschatology. Problem was that there was this division of fanatics of the Anabaptists in Munster, Germany, and that, of course, is going to taint the reputation of Anabaptists all throughout the rest of Europe. So you've got, for the most part, the 90% of Anabaptists are really good, right? They're really good stuff. They're going back to New Testament theology at the church. They're doing the same things. You can get to 10% of the crazies that kind of cause the rest of the movement to get kind of, maybe this isn't what we thought it was. So you had some fanatics going on, kind of going crazy and causing some problems as well. They were also persecuted during the Radical Reformation. And that persecution, of course, was there simply or solely to limit the influence of this Reformation. They would go in and target the Anabaptist leaders and have them executed out in front of people, let them know, persecution was going to happen. The first Anabaptist to be executed, it was in May of 1525. Grebel, who was kind of one of the leaders of this Reformation, he died in a plague in 1526. The Zurich Town Council, led by Zwingli, executed Felix Manz. So Manz was a leader, a follower of Zwingli, a student of Zwingli. He then gets executed in 1527. It kind of tells you the difference here in what these reformations were going on. Another former Catholic priest, Michael Sattler, burned at the stake, May 1527. George Blarick, one of the main three of the Anabaptist movement, he was burned at the stake in Austria in 1529. And by 1529, the imperial decree for any person that likened themselves as an Anabaptist was death. Right? If you were an Anabaptist, going to an Anabaptist church, following Anabaptist doctrine, you were going to be put to death. But that did not stop the movement. Okay, it did not stop the movement. Now, there are 4 major things there, right? 4 pretty big things that the Anabaptist movement was faced with, but yet still managed to kind of soldier through even all this stuff. Why do you think that stopping the Anabaptist radical Reformation, whatever you want to call it, why do you think it was so difficult for it to stop?
Stopping somebody that believes they're right.
Exactly, right? A lot of what they were doing, they were standing up for the truth, going against infant baptism, going against some of the stuff that Luther was teaching, the Protestant Reformation, as it became more nationalized, I guess, kind of more branded, I guess you can kind of look at it that way. They were standing up for the truth, and they knew that in the end they weren't going to lose, even if they're going to die. Right? Martyrdom to them was not losing. It was just part of the process of them standing up for what they believed in. All right, now, the Anabaptist group of the 16th century held common beliefs. As a matter of fact, I'm going to read you 8 of these, and you're going to say, those sound really familiar. Okay? A lot of Christian groups hold on to them today, and they were one of the distinctions of the Anabaptist. All right, so there are 8 of these. Here are the first one: individual liberty of conscience in matters of religion. Second thing, voluntary church membership of confessing and practicing adults. Baptism upon confession of faith and a promise of a holy life. Communion as a commemoration of Christ. Absolute separation between church and state, including for some groups pacifism and prohibition from taking oaths. Elders were chosen by the congregation to administer the word and for discipline. Practical application of biblical teaching was more important than theology. Church discipline included shunning. Okay? So those are kind of the 8 common beliefs of Anabaptists. And some of those we have here, some of them we don't, right? Some of the things was different from the things that we practice here at our church. Most Baptist and evangelical churches, don't accept pacifism and the prohibition of oaths. And we don't shun people either. That we do. That doesn't kind of go on here. There are some more radical forms of Anabaptism that lasted. And some of these beliefs are in certain divisions or certain groups of people. Just one that, kind of common. Pacifism and shunning and stuff. Does anybody know what group of people that does happen in still today? The Amish do that. Yeah, the Amish do that. They're very non-confrontational. They will shun people. That happens because of these Anabaptist beliefs. That's where they got some of their, a division of that. We could go through a whole thing with the Amish as well. But that's kind of where they got that from. Okay, so those are the suppressed, the persecuted, the hounded Anabaptist brethren planted seeds that have become essentially core values for Western society as we know it. All right, the truth of individual liberties in matters of religion, the separate spheres of religion and state, the benefits of an open, non-coercive society. All find their roots in the Anabaptist brethren, in the Anabaptist movement. So it seems that the fear of the authorities had that the Anabaptist teaching could unravel the structure of society, while it did have some validity. For the most part, those teachings and what they kind of came up with has pretty much shaped the Western Hemisphere for the last, 500-600 years now. Okay, so that finishes up with that lesson, and we're going to jump right on over into lesson 9, Chad, if you will, please. This is going to move over into the 16th and 17th centuries. We're going to move on from Zwingli and Luther to the next third important person of the Reformation. Anybody know who that might be? No? John Calvin. All right, John Calvin is the next guy that we're going to look at. And the Reformation now is going to move from Europe, Western Europe, over into England. And we're going to start to be able to trace some roots to Quakers and to Pilgrims and to eventually, the scriptures you're getting in America. It's kind of where this kind of leads to as we kind of work through this. All right. So John Calvin is the next guy that we kind of talk about. And the Reformation under Martin Luther and under Zwingli the foundation has been laid. The embers are there. People are still listening to it. When John Calvin comes in, it's like he throws the forge on it. The Reformation just catches fire. Okay? Groundwork laid by Luther and Zwingli. Now, later on in Luther and Zwingli, some of the stuff they did wasn't great, okay? But, I stood up here and told you, Martin Luther, aside from Paul, in far as the post-Christ ascension, Paul was the most influential person for the Scripture. A lot of people argue that Martin Luther could have been number 2, just because of what he did and what he took on, okay? What he was writing about. Calvin, as we'll see, a Luther reader, and studied other things as well, but he was another individual that kind of taken this Reformation and really allowed it to explode, as we're going to kind of see here through the life of John Calvin as well. All right, John Calvin, just some background on him, studied law, knew Greek, knew Hebrew, was pretty fluent in both of them. He was experienced. That helps. That was having that experience is going to help him in a ministry later on, as we'll see. His spiritual conversion, his actual spiritual conversion, is something that is a bit of a mystery. A lot of writers have a lot of different things to kind of say. Most of them will tell you, though, that his spiritual conversion is shrouded in mystery. He just randomly suddenly left Paris in December of 1533 because he was a fear of the authorities who were arresting reformers. Okay. Traveled to Basel, Switzerland. He published the Institutes of the Christian Religion, and what that is the very first systematic summary of Reformed theology. So he takes Luther stuff, he takes some Anabaptist stuff, he takes some Zwingli stuff, and he combines them all and writes a pamphlet, book, whatever you want to call it, the Institutes of Christian Religion, and this was kind of the starting point of a bunch of literature for Reformed theology. He took parts of the 95 Thesis, took parts of what Zwingli was saying, took some stuff from the Anabaptists as well, as far as baptism things going, and some of the other ordinances they were talking about in New Testament theology in their church, and he puts it out there for people to read. Okay, John Calvin was well educated, well studied, well spoken. He was, would have been a really good politician or a really good businessman if he was in present time. Kind of a short little fellow, but he was highly intelligent, very charismatic as far as whether he spoke, not in his theology, but was a guy that would have been easy to listen to. Okay, and really intelligent. So he was writing some stuff down. 1536, 1538 is their two Geneva instances here that we have to talk about because they are really, really important. He eventually returns to France in 1536. He thinks persecution was over. It's not, so he has to leave again. There's a battle going on all through the middle part of Europe, so he kind of changes his route and ends up in Geneva, Switzerland. Okay, Geneva, Switzerland itself is in the midst of a ton of turmoil, a ton of reform that is going on as well. Farel is a reformer that was there and was trying to reform the cities and the towns and stuff in Geneva, but he was overwhelmed with it. Farel convinces Calvin that Geneva was where John Calvin needed to be. Okay, Farel is trying to convince John Calvin that he needs to be there in Geneva. That needs to be the kind of the centerpiece of his ministry. Calvin doesn't agree with that, doesn't think that's true, but reluctantly decides to stay and he agrees to stay as well. And while he's there, immerses himself in the work of reform. But the city's council of 200 did not like Calvin, did not like the things that he was preaching, did not like his Reformation, said it was way too radical. But he refused to let the Council of 200 dictate the terms of the reform in the church. So he and Farel got kicked out of Geneva in 1538. From 1538 to 1541, as you can see up here, he is in France as a refugee. And while he was in France, he learns practical theology under a guy named Martin Bucer and Wolfgang Capito. And while there, the theology is eventually going to help him here in the coming years. All right? Martin Bucer, Wolfgang Capito were theologians and scholars who were well-versed in what they call New Testament theology for the church. They were old school guys that knew how the church was going on. John Calvin learned from them, learned good stuff from them, okay, to kind of put it without getting too wordy about things, right? It was good that he was there because he learned a lot of good stuff under them. Back in 1541, he goes back to Geneva, all right? And he's there, as you can see, until 1564. It's in crisis when he shows up. The Roman Catholic cardinal had sent letters to Geneva to make, overtures to return to Rome. The letter sent to Calvin for his response, and he has a defense of the reform for the Roman Catholic Church. And essentially what he does is he persuades the council that's there that just kicked him out, we tried to kick him out 3 or 4 years ago. He convinces the council to reject the appeal from the Roman Catholic Church. Okay? And that just essentially kind of fires Calvin up to push the reform even farther. And it kind of renews his vigor for leading the reform. So now he has the backing of the council, and they agree to immediately implement the lessons that he learned while he was in Strasbourg, and instituting new form of church governance in civil authorities, the church authorities, to attain the holy theocracy by which God's law became a citizen. Right, this is why this is important. This is going to get wordy. I don't want this to get too wordy. This is what Calvin set up, okay? This is why these 2 Geneva things are up here. This is why we look at his early life. This is why this is important to us, okay? And then this stuff will sound familiar, okay? While in Geneva the second time, this is the Reformation that he set up in churches. Okay, the first one is this. The pastors of churches were the preachers and the administrators of communion. That's the first one. Secondly, teachers or doctors of instruction in theology, in Greek and in Hebrew. So he wanted that being taught in universities and in the churches that were around as well. Third thing is this, elders, composed of 12 laymen from 3 councils of the city, and their responsibility was to visit with congregational members, church members, within their district, and then to maintain church discipline as well. So he set up a council of elders that kind of governed the church, okay? The fourth thing was deacons. So he administered and made sure deacons were appointed, and the deacons were there to assist the pastors of these churches in Geneva, and then help with relief with the poor and the needy as well. Calvin gives the city council the responsibility to carry out the punishment of those disciplined by the church. Calvin's model was a Constantine connection of the church and the state. All right? So Calvin was still hostage to a worldview that could not imagine absolute separation of church and state was possible, or that it was even biblical at all. So in Geneva during this time, if you were a churchgoer, you'd have to imagine living under a state-run church still. While what they were doing in the church was good. Okay, the deacons, the way they were setting stuff up, what they were teaching, all was good. It was still being ran by the state. So there's still what we'd call true freedom of religion like we have here. Calvin wrote commentaries on most books of the Bible. That's what his legacy kind of is. His commentaries and sermons demonstrate a commitment to historical and grammatical interpretation of scriptures. John Calvin's commentaries are still in print and oftentimes even used by pastors and scholars even today. Calvin's model of church reform and governance was adapted and transplanted successfully throughout all of Europe, but it kind of was going on under the radar. Kind of didn't know the Roman Church didn't really know exactly what was going on. His Institutes of the Christian Religion, that became a dominant theology of the Reformed churches. Hundreds of Calvin's disciples in Geneva left, eventually returned to their homelands in hopes of creating Christian commonwealths of their own. Okay, and we still hear today. You still hear Calvinism, right? We still do Calvinisms in some of the theology and doctrines that Calvin was teaching. We won't spend time talking about what some of the doctrines were with predestination and certain things that we don't need to get into. But he was, as far as we can take Calvin's legacy, and we can put it under a microscope and see that a lot of it was good and some of it wasn't as good. What's important for us, though, as far as the history of the church, right? We won't spend a ton of time talking about, like, doctrinally where he might have been had some mistakes. But as far as church reformation, really important. Anything that pulls people away from the Catholic Church and closer to the New Testament church is good. As far as the overarching theme of getting people away from the Catholic theology. And that's what the 15, 16, and 1400s was all about. So the Reformation is all about. Teaching good doctrine, most of the time, yes, but getting people away, a new way of thinking about church, right? Getting them back to a New Testament style of church, and away from a more of a Roman Catholic style is always and will always be a good thing. All right, go ahead, Chad. Go to the next thing, Reformation in England. Back here. There's John Calvin. All right. Reformation that took place in England. Englishman William Tyndale, he was reading Erasmus's Greek New Testament, and Tyndale in Europe becomes passionate about providing the Word of God to Christians in their own languages. Okay, he translated the New Testament from Greek into English in Holland in 1525, and then once he got it translated, went to the printing press, got it printed. The copies of his translation in the New Testament, they were shipped to England. Brilliant, poised to rise to the ranks of the Catholic Church, Tyndale was. He got a hold of some good New Testament teaching, and it changed his life. And he chose to stand for the truth and spread the Word of God instead of kind of rising through the ranks of the Catholic Church. Luther's works and ideas, they're circulating around England during this time as well. So Luther, Tyndale, among others, are laying the groundwork for the Reformation in England. All right, King Henry VIII had his own version of the church that he had in mind as well, and he needed an heir to his throne. Because his wife Agnes, or excuse me, wife Catherine, she would only bore him one daughter. So he had, of course, again, feudalism, kings have sons, those sons take over, and that's how the kingdoms continue, or how those family lines continue to stay in power. So King Henry VIII didn't have any sons. Mary Tudor is the only daughter that he had. So Catherine had been married to Henry's brother. His death meant that Henry was to marry Catherine. The king believed he had no male heir because God was punishing him for marrying Catherine. Pope Clement VII refused to grant Henry VIII an annulment at all from his marriage. So Henry then takes matters into his own hands and had Parliament transfer the headship of the English Catholic Church from the Pope to the King. So starting in 1534, only the English priests and bishops who recognized the newly formed Church of England. Okay, that's going to become important to us in about 110 years. The newly formed Church of England, only they could be in power, and only those popes or bishops, that recognized the Church of England could retain their positions. Now that Henry's in charge of the church, he grants himself a divorce, marries 7 more wives, beheads 2 of them, and then eventually has a self-serving creation of the Church of England that begins to affect Reformation in England. Okay? Let me get to the implementation of Reformation ideas and I'll be done. Because I think if I give you too much more stuff today, your brains might explode. The implementation of the Reformation ideas that took place in England, Thomas Cranmer, who was the Archbishop of a place called Canterbury, he is gradually implementing these Protestant reformations into churches in England. He abolishes the Catholic monasteries, has new articles of faith written. King Henry even sanctions something called the Coverdale Bible. That was in 1537. Edward VI, who is Henry's son, approves more of these reforms, but he was only in power for about 6 years. Mary Tudor. So if you remember, Mary Tudor was King Henry's only original daughter, I guess, or the first daughter. She aggressively attempts to get the English church to return to Rome, to reverse the progress made by Reformation. She revoked laws that put the church under authority of the state and executed about 300 Protestants, including Thomas Cranmer, who was putting the Reformations in, as well as another translator of scriptures named John Rogers. She was in charge for about 5 years. Elizabeth I followed Mary Tudor, and she was a Protestant sympathizer, and the Protestants embraced her reign with great anticipation, and during her reign, there were hundreds of Protestant immigrants that returned to England. Now, the first Parliament during Elizabeth's reign passed a series of statutes that reformed the church to even more so of what it had been before Queen Mary Tudor was in power. Okay? So that's the beginning of the Reformation that takes place in England. So you've got King Henry, who starts a Church of England. You had one of his daughters who tried to get rid of the Church of England, go back to the Roman Catholic Church. His great-granddaughter, Elizabeth I, she grew up amongst the Protestant Reformation there. She saw some of the things that were going on, so she directs the church back to more of Reformation ideas. But the biggest, most important part of this is that there's now a Church of England set up that is going through some Reformation that is opposite of the Roman Catholic Church. So by 1550, okay, so the notes has been a lot, and I apologize. But by 1550, we've got Roman Catholic Church, Protestant Reformation, Anabaptist Reformation, Reformation of the Church of England, that's also going through its own division of Protestant Reformation. Okay, so the religious landscape, as far as worldwide on a whole, is getting a complete and total overhaul. All right. And next week in Scotland, which is another area of lots of people, the Scottish kings and the Scottish kingdom was in a huge power right now as well. Started because of the Roman Catholic Church, but it is also going to go through Reformation as well. So we've talked about 4 or 5 different things that were happening, but we got to remember it's all happening at the exact same time, right? It's all going on within 10 or 15 years of each other. And that's why we're seeing such a great change during the 15 and 1600s. Okay, so Reformation ideas pulling people away from the Catholic Church is always going to be a good thing. Development of the printing press in Gutenberg in the 1500s allowed these translators to get scriptures out to people in their native language. That's probably not talked about a lot, but probably the most important reason why Reformation is happening, because people were able to get stuff they could read and understand. That led to all these guys as well preaching and teaching and kind of making sure that reformations and things were going on. So next week we go John Knox, who is in Scotland. That will then lead us to individuals in England called the Puritans. Okay, and the Puritans are important because the Puritans lead us to the Pilgrims, right? And the Pilgrims eventually gets the New Testament church here in America. And we're leading to that, right? 1612, 19, 17. When did the Pilgrims show up? 16, what was it? Anybody remember off the top of their head? 1632, is that when it was? So we're within 100 years here of getting them to here. And as much Reformation that was taking place in England, the Bible spreads through the world when America starts sending out missionaries. It was happening in other places, but early on when churches kind of set up in the 18 and early 1900s here, when America was much more godly, we were pumping out missionaries like crazy, and a lot of people, and it's not happening as much. As a matter of fact, people are sending missionaries to us now, which is kind of sad. But that's kind of how the progression of scriptures gets to different places and how it's time to get spread. So we're getting there, but it started with, and I know I've said this 100 times, it starts with Martin Luther and the Reformation guy that was kind of able to kind of step out against the Catholic Church. All right, so next week, Reformation, Scotland, English Puritans, Church of England, the Anglo-Saxons comes down, and we get some Pilgrims over here teaching some Native Americans about God. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you again for being able to kind of look through this history, which again, I guess for some can be a little boring, I guess, but it's such an important thing to look at and be able to see how you managed if we kind of trace this back and think that there in Capernaum, where was kind of the local portion of your ministry while you were here, and how it kind of disciples and then the apostles and then the missionaries, and how it branched out and managed to make its way all the way across the globe. And it was obviously, number one, because of your sovereignty, but two, because of people who were concerned with other people hearing the truth. Pretty crazy odds or odds that they faced that they didn't care about. I mean, continue to stay bold and continue to do what was needed to be done so that the gospel could be spread. Lord, I think it's a lesson for us, these old soft Christians that live here today. The importance of people knowing the truth and standing for it, standing for the truth regardless of what obstacles be in our way. I pray, Lord, if nothing else, do this. We learn some stuff, sure. Maybe things we forgot and kind of see really important. But nothing else as we continue through this, and we've got 3 or 4 lessons left to go, that we see the importance of people being sure that other people were told the truth. They stood for the truth regardless of what was going on. I pray, Lord, we're people of the truth, and that we'll stand for it. Fight for it if we have to, regardless of what's going on around us. I pray that's the way we are, Lord. And there's nothing else that gives us a desire to do that. I pray for Pastor Rob here as he comes through the next few minutes as well. Jesus, use him, Lord, in a mighty way. Keep us attentive to the word you have for us this morning. In your name I pray.